Welcome back to the shop. All right, today, Evey Part 4. And what we're going to do today with that is these transmissions. So here we have Toyota E153, specifically the MR2 version, because it's got the shift shaft in the rear here, and a Toyota E350. So this is out of a first gen Scion TC. And these have some family lineage. This is a direct descendant of this, except this is much lighter. We know that the differential on this is weak, but the differential is not hard to fix. And what I want to do today is disassemble both of these and figure out, are the gears the same width? Do they look like they're, from everything I can tell without testing the metallurgy, is there a reason why the internals of this should be weaker than the internals of this, other than the differential that we already know of? So let's get into it. So why are we doing this? Obviously, it's not because I have a shortage of E153s. I've got one sitting in Evey right now. I've got one right here that's complete. I've got two more complete in the back of the shop. And I've got several bins of parts out of E-Series transmissions that are compatible with the E153 from the different final drives I've scavenged over the years. So I could probably keep this transmission going for a good long time. There's no reason for me to go away from it, except Evey, as a drag car, the less mass you have to accelerate, the faster you're going to go. So, to a point, you've got aerodynamic drag also. But I believe that this thing is significantly lighter, and that would be a good place to start, because once we're in the E153, there's not a whole lot to be done to lighten it up. How we're going to determine that, before we get too deep into this, we're going to use my shipping scale, and we're going to weigh them. I've got these trimmed out to basically to be the exact same thing. So I've removed all the brackets from them. I've even removed the shift arms, because I'll see the MR2 one here is much lighter than the Scion one, so I removed that to not affect the readings. They both have no shift fork, throw-out bearing, and I've both attempted to empty them from oil as much as I can, which means there's probably some oil remaining. There's definitely some oil remaining in them, but they should both be about the same. That's going to make a couple ounces difference, not pounds. And I'm expecting this to be closer to a probably 15 to 20 pound difference. So let's check it out. So the E350, I'm not sure if you can read that, but that's 94.2 pounds. And the E153, 118.5 pounds. So if my math's correct, that's 24 pounds lighter. Considering we got to bring this car all the way down to 2,000 pounds or less, 24 pounds is huge. We can't give up 24 pounds unless there's a legitimate reason to go with this heavier trans. Now, some of that weight you can see is in the case back here, but a lot of it has to do, actually, let me get these back to the same height. So now you can see them at the same height, and the angle of the camera might not be too obvious, but this thing's a solid 2 inches or so lower. It comes almost to where this overdrive part of the case comes on. So this is a significantly shorter transmission. That's why we call these the narrow case transmissions, and this is the wide case transmissions. Now, narrow versus wide refers to this center section here. So you can see this is shorter than this. The overdrive housing is about the same, and the other half, the front half of the case, the bell housing, is about the same. There is one more version of this case that I don't have here to show you. See how this differential here comes out further? This is the all-wheel drive capable case. Now, obviously, this is out of an MR2, so it's not all-wheel drive, but it's all-wheel drive capable if you replace the differential, whereas this one is not. But there is a narrow case version that has the wide differential. So in theory, with that one, you'd get some of the weight savings, though you'd lose some weight for the differential. But if everything else we find in here is good except for the differential, we can use all the differential offerings from the E153 by, instead of getting the E350, we get the E352F out of a RAV4 and swap in a two-wheel drive differential, and we're good to go. By the way, I apologize for all the noise in the background. It's a really sunny day outside, and the roof is expanding. That's all the click, 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 click you're hearing. So I'm sorry. There's not much I can do if I want to shoot these during the day. All right, so let's dig in. Actually, no. Before we dig in, let's continue talking about external differences. So we've already covered this. Now it's important to note, along with that change, you can see, actually let me bring the camera around. So you can see this section here is much smaller. This, on the all-wheel drive capable, you would take this plate off and change the differential, and you'd put the transfer case would be bolted onto here. In this angle, the other thing to note is the bell housing here has been updated. There's a couple more bolt holes on this one. Now, this is not going to be all of the 300 series, E-series, because this one was made to bolt to a Z. I think there's still one that was made to bolt to a 3S, so it'll have this bolt pattern, but you can bolt a 3S onto this one. There's only a couple minor differences in this case, which means you might be missing a couple bolts, but you'll still have more than enough to hold it together. All right, let's flip and continue looking at the differences. The next significant difference is the shift linkage. So this one here, you've got this that goes in, and essentially this goes in and out and rotates to get into gears. And this one here, the mechanism's at exactly the same spot, except the lever. So there's a cap here where that output would be, and the back of this is machined, and that has the lever coming out the back. And it still moves in exactly the same way, in and out and rotate. The mechanism inside is the same. So if we use this one in Evey, I will have to machine this out, and I'll have to use this lever inside of there. And also the external linkage, but the external linkage bolts to points, like it uses these two bolt points, even though obviously the Scion didn't use it, the bolt point is still there. So it shouldn't take too much modification to be able to use that. And as you can see, this is the left side motor mount. This is the same bolt pattern as this, and they're both at the same distance from the bell housing. So that's usable as is. If we move to the front, over here, there's not a whole lot of differences. You can see it looks like they went from this rubber boot here for the E153 to something that's more cast in for the vent for the clutch. That's obviously insignificant. The starter mounts, while the pattern on here is slightly different, they will both fit the same starters. Going to under the transmission. So here, we unfortunately see a couple other major changes. This loop right here, this is the transmission cooler that's inside the E153. Now, obviously, this isn't providing much of a cooler. The cooler was designed more for the all-track application, but importantly, in the MR2, all of the hardware is still there. The pump is still in there, and it's pumping into here, which is then providing, actually, I don't know if it's pumping into here or here. We'll see when we're inside the case. But then the other one is providing pressurized lube to certain parts of the transmission. So that obviously isn't. And on top of that, if you see the bolt here, if you see the bolt holes here, 1, 2, 3, 4, here it's 1, 2, 3, this whole section of the transmission here is missing. So that means the bell housings are not interchangeable. Continuing to the back of the transmission. So externally, what you can see, there's a couple things. The speedometer drive on the E153 here is out the back of the transmission. And on this one, it's actually, we're going to see it from the other angle, it's from the top. And because this whole part of the case here changes, the rear mount also changes because of that. So if we put this in Evey, we're going to need a custom rear mount. Not a big deal, but it's something to do. Going to the top. Actually, we already covered the top. So the other thing to note about the top is there's a couple of these bolt patterns for the shift linkage that are different. And down there, if you can see it, actually, I don't think you can see it. Down here is your speedometer drive. There you go. Can you see it? So not a direct swap. And then the other thing I can tell that's different without even opening them up is the shafts obviously go from the front of the case all the way back here for the overdrive. Since this is 2 inches shorter, that's telling us that the shafts, the input shaft and the output shaft are not interchangeable between the cases. The gears might be. Now, first and second gear are, at least on the E153, are machined onto the shaft. I suspect we're going to find the same thing on the E350. So those have to stay with the transmission. Now there's a couple other E300 series that we can pull first and second out of. So I think there's a couple different options, but they're all going to be shorter than the options that we have here on the E153. So next thing, we're just going to start the disassembly. On these ones, we can either start with the shift linkage or the overdrive part of the case. And I'm going to go ahead and start with the shift linkage. So we're going to take those out and compare them. Okay, so then if we look at the shafts again, you can see this here is what actually actuates the shift forks, here and here. That part is identical. It looks like the spring here on the E351 is a little bit shorter. That's probably just because of the shape of the case. That's probably interchangeable. Now I do notice this part here, if I look inside the case, actually, let me show you inside the case. So if we look inside the case, that's actuating on this, and you can see it can flip forward and it can go up. And that's how the transmission stops you from shifting into reverse after you've gone to fifth. So you need to go back to the center neutral position before you can go over and down to reverse. E350 here, I don't actually see it. It might be this that isn't on here, but it doesn't make sense too much with what I'm seeing inside the transmission. So the unfortunate side here is this may not be directly interchangeable. We'll have to see. We might end up, if we do end up using the E350, we might end up making a custom shaft for it. Now, the shaft is not that complicated, right? It's just a straight bar with a little notch there. You know, this is ground to a specific diameter, but I would just start with something that's already ground to the right diameter. It's got a couple roll pin holes, and I think these are also held in. And yeah, these are held in with C-clips, if you can see inside there. Probably not, but not a big deal at all to make that shaft. Next, let's go for these overdrive cases here. So something I didn't expect when I was first getting into this is this cover can even use shorter bolts because the cover's not as thick. Let's check if they're interchangeable. So this one has these dowel pins here, which makes it a little hard to put on there, but we can try the other way. Yeah, so they're exactly the same shape. And interestingly, there's even the room for the dowel holes in there. And frankly, I don't know why this is aligned with dowels. This pipe here matters a little bit how it's aligned, but not really, not to dowel level precision. So yeah, these are extra then. If we end up with an E153, I'm not putting those back into the reassembled case. Let's get a weight difference on these. So the E351 is 2.28 pounds. Oh, you know what? Wow, okay. Even with the fasteners, because this is steel and that's aluminum, this is 0.06 pounds lighter, even once you count the fasteners in it. All right, never mind. That's the lighter part of the case. Sometimes intuition is not always correct. Now, something I immediately noticed that scares me. See this gear here? See how high it is? And see how high this one is? This one here on the E153 is higher than this. Now, there's potentially a couple explanations. On the E153, I think all of the gears are, 17 millimeters. We'll measure them when we get them out. It's just hard to get something in there to measure it. And frankly, the overdrive doesn't need to be that beefy. So maybe they made the savings on some gears. Frankly, as long as 1, 2, 3, 4 is the correct thickness, then I'm not worried about it. But this definitely, right? They made the consideration to thin these out, so possibly that's where they save the rest of the space here in this case. Now, let's take the reverse fork out. So this is the kind of C-clip that needs to be hammered out. We're going to put a little clay here to catch it. And by the way, if you need some of these tools here that I'm about to use, I have put links in the description. Those links do give me a couple dollars if you buy through there, so it's certainly appreciated, but you know, it's there to help you guys out. Now, because reverse likes to fly off, what I like to do on this one is I get the bolts tight, and then I just give it gentle taps, and then I'll turn in the slide hammer a little bit more. And then this thing wants to fly off in a million pieces, so be gentle pulling it out. And there we go. Now be careful when putting this thing back in. Things get easily out of alignment on this thing, so you want to make sure you get everything at the right place. Oh, all right, I guess it just needed one more hit. So it might be a little bit hard to tell from your angle, but the synchro design doesn't look like it has been updated. And the thickness of, actually, the thickness of the E350 one is actually slightly more. But it looks like they would likely be interchangeable. Now that we can get this gear off, let me go get something to measure it. Be right back. Now, armed with some calipers, let's see what we got here. So 13.43, it's called 13.5. And 18.8. So a little over 5 millimeters difference. That's huge. And honestly doesn't bode well at all. Oh, that's not good. Is that? That's rusty looking in there. That may bode badly for this exact transmission, but that doesn't invalidate our checks. And a quick trick, if you find yourself using a 3-jaw puller on these things, you'll find it extremely frustrating sometimes. Sometimes using these pullers here that can't unlock from the gear, they're kind of like a Pitman arm puller, but designed for stuff like this. Again, there'll be a link down in the description. And they're just so much easier for something like this. Oh. Really? That's not supposed to happen. So we're trying to remove all of these little clips. Next thing we're going to do, we're going to remove this bearing retainer plate. Now, it's super important on this. These bolts, the heads might as well be made out of cheese. There's only one tool to remove those. Anything else, you're going to strip them out. And it's this guy. It's an impact driver, but normally when people think of an impact driver, they think of this. If you use this, I promise you'll strip it out. This, I'll show you how you use it here in a second. So grab it, grab a nice big hammer, and you hold it in the direction of loosening, and then it comes right out. And the difference with this is when you're hitting with the hammer, it's pushing down as well as twisting, and because of that, it can't cam out. These just cam out too easily otherwise. We'll get a bigger hammer. Now, I wasn't asking please. There. Just had to get a little more violent with it. Another difference we see now, see this hole right here, there's nothing coming out of it. Right here, this is the pressure spray bar. That's what keeps all the gears cooled down. All right, next we want to remove all the detent balls. Otherwise these go flying when you take the transmission apart. Okay, so as noted earlier, there's no detent ball up here. There's also none here or here. Are there any detent balls on this transmission? Or were they all replaced with this one singular detent? That's a nice cost savings. No. All right, well, we're both in uncharted territory. Now, next, this one gets a lot of people. This here holds the reverse idler shaft in, so this has to come out. So, check this out. Interestingly, they finally figured out that that one's an absolute pain. The E153 is only tapered a little bit. You do want to keep this bolt separately because this tiny taper makes it a lot easier to install, but look at that taper. That's got to be a lot better to install. Take all the case bolts and split it apart. And there are case bolts in the bell housing, so it's always easier to get those first. All right, let's crack the case. Sorry, it's been a while since I've done this. So this shaft is supposed to go down with it, and I thought this ring was what we need to remove. There's actually a bigger snap ring around here. This might be a snap ring I can actually use a snap ring tool on. Yeah. There we go. Now some gentle taps. There we go. And lift and jiggle. And there we go. E153 internals. There we go. Lift and jiggle. And there we are. Oh. Oh, that doesn't look promising. All right, well, let's start. Not that this one really matters, but reverse. There's a bit of a difference there. So 15.5 versus 23 millimeters. So that might be a weight savings opportunity, but it's, again, not going to be an easy swap. So you see the thickness here versus the thickness here. This is the E153, it's narrower, and if you look at this, you can see this is a nicely machined piece of steel with a bearing surface here. If we look at this one, stamped piece of steel, and it's just riding right on the stamped surface there. So that's interesting. And I mean, this is the kind of thing that just goes towards the weight loss of the transmission. I totally don't mind that. It's not like reverse is a often used gear. But interestingly, if you look at the tower it's on, actually, you know what? That's powdered metal. That's not machined. Same with this. But it's still a more expensive process than just bending a bit of sheet metal. But interestingly, this tower here hasn't changed. All right, so let's compare gear widths. So first gear on the E350 is 13.5, and on the 153 is 17. Second gear, now I'm only going to be able to measure the counter gear here. 12.75 versus 17.5. Third gear, well, this is not going to be exact, but that'll get us close. 12.75 again, and I think this one's 17. This one's 16. Then fourth, 13 1/4 versus 18. So that's interesting. Let's see what the diameter in here, which is on this transmission anyways, this is the smallest part of the input shaft. 26.92, call it 27. 26.82. Okay, that's just manufacturing tolerances. So they're the same diameter. So that's interesting. Oh, let's get the ring gear. So about 27.5. Within a millimeter, if they're not exactly the same. They're probably exactly the same. Now, this is where you can see the all-wheel drive capable differential here is thicker right here versus this one. So there's one more thing I want to discuss as a comparison point before I put these things away. This is an EB62, or is it an EB60? It doesn't matter, it's just the ratio difference between the two. Transmission output shaft, and this guy right here is 16.2 versus the 14 millimeters or the 17.2. So this is really somewhere in between this, and that kind of carries for all the gears. So I think as a comparison point, I think we should weigh an EB62. Conveniently, I have one of those right here. So check it out, 113.7. Now, if you remove this bracket, this, and this to make it comparable to the other transmissions we were comparing, you're probably down to 105 or so. So about splitting the difference. And interestingly, the gears are about splitting the difference as far as thickness goes. So where to go from here? Well, obviously, there's no doubt the E153 is a stronger transmission. The numbers we keep hearing about this thing, not that I've ever been near that power, is around 700 horsepower to the ground, this thing starts braking. That number may or may not be high, but whatever that number is, it's higher than this. And the number we keep hearing from the Scion TC folks is they seem to brake these things somewhere around 400 to the ground. Now, interestingly, the EB62 that I just pulled up here a second ago, the Scion TC folks also brake that around 400 horsepower to the ground, which is really suspicious given how much closer to the gear thickness of the E153 that one is. Now, that brings up another point. Do you see the unsupported shaft length? So there's a bearing here and a bearing here. So we can see 6 1/4 there unsupported and 7 1/2. So that makes a big difference, because part of what breaks the teeth on these things is the shafts are deflecting away from each other. So what I'm starting to wonder is 400 horsepower in a front wheel drive car like the TC guys are having, that's going to come with wheel hop. Is that why the Scion TC guys are braking it? Because I don't see how this transmission and the EB60 should be braking at the same horsepower level. It just doesn't seem right. But if there's a whole bunch of wheel hop, that wheel hop breaks things. That's a very known fact. So I don't know, if there's some of you guys out there that are Scion TC folks, maybe you can speak a bit more to it. I've looked all around and I can't find pictures of how this transmission breaks when it breaks for the Scion TC guys. If some of you guys can provide information as to where I could find those or the pictures themselves, there's an email down in the description. Feel free to use that to send those to me. I would sincerely appreciate it. The other thing that's got me somewhat confused right now is the 26-pound weight loss doesn't appear to be mostly in the case. In fact, now that I see these internals, it appears to be mostly in the internals. So that's not just 26 pounds weight loss, that's 26 pounds of rotating mass, and some of that is spinning at engine speed or at higher than road speed, right? Because the output shaft, is still spinning 4 times faster-ish than the actual axles. So that'll make a difference. In fact, that should make a pretty noticeable difference. And the weight loss between the transmissions is almost 4% of my goal. I need to lose about 600 pounds on the car. 26 pounds. That's not insignificant. And finally, this guy right here, the E153, is known for locking shifts out of second gear at, when you're shifting at 8,000 RPM. There's a good chance my 1-2 shift is going to be even above 8,000 RPM by the time I'm making the right power. The amount of weight loss on this thing, maybe that'll help the 1-2 shift. And then finally, let's say 400 wheel horsepower is the right number for this transmission. I'm aiming for 350. If I get to 350, there's a good chance I can get the record. And it's not like it would be a huge investment for me to be into this thing for. So I've got E153s kicking around when I need to upgrade. The only thing I need to do is I need to make the shift shaft. I need to make a custom output stub and a rear motor mount, and otherwise everything just works. So let me show you one more thing. The other thing that could be advantageous, the other half of it's in the house. This is actually a Quaife differential, a helical differential for the E350. I bought this because it was dirt cheap to see if it would fit the EB62. It doesn't, unfortunately, but that means I already have it here, which this would be one of the most expensive things. So if I go with that, instead of getting a custom spool made, my investment in running the E350 is pretty minimal. And the potential gains certainly, well, they certainly are there. So I don't know. I haven't made up my mind yet. If you've got some opinions, please, leave them down in the comments. I'd like to see what you guys are thinking. And the other thing too, if I go take this thing out and I abuse this thing on the racetrack, it could give us a much better idea in the MR2 where it breaks. Or maybe it's perfectly fine to 350 with drag launches, in which case this could potentially be a really good intermediate between the S54 that is now hard to get, as well as the E153, right? Maybe this guy can sit somewhere in between. These things are available right now. Now, of course, if I make a kit to drop those in the MR2, there's not enough of these out there. As soon as I were to make that kit, these things would become unavailable. I promise that. These things would jack up to $2,000 and become unavailable. So I think I need to sleep on it. I'm going to say there's a solid maybe that I end up going to this. And you know what? Maybe this is a winter project. So what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to hang on to this transmission. I'm not going to use it right away. I'm going to go ahead and use the E153 that's already sitting in Evey. And once I get some numbers at the drag strip, and they don't even have to be particularly fast numbers, that'll tell me kind of what my shift times are. That'll tell me just how much of a lockout problem I'm having with second gear. And because the gearing on this, it's not as ideal as the E153. So I can then take those curves and I can map them over to this transmission, calculate for the weight loss a little bit, calculate for the shift times, because this thing will need 3 shifts down the track instead of 2, and see if it would be advantageous. I suspect it'll end up being there. I suspect it'll end up being worth it. So yeah. Wait up. I can leave you with something better, though. I can leave you with something that looks much nicer. So check this out. At the end of the last video, I didn't show you guys what the mount design would look like because I didn't have it designed. But since we last talked, what you see right here is the design for the 2AR motor mount. This is fairly lightweight. It's going to be a cast aluminum mount, and then importantly, the isolator. So unlike my previous 2GR design, I decided I'd make the isolator separate. And by putting it separately, it helps a couple things. So it means that on the 2AR, it's going to be easier to install because putting that cross bolt in, it's always a pain. Whereas now you can just drop the motor on it, and then because the chassis end up all being slightly different lengths, it doesn't matter. Those holes will be slotted slightly, and you just drop it on there and you sink your bolts in and you're done. Next video, we're going to use the position of the engine in the car so that we now know where our ECU needs to be mounted, and we're probably going to make the dramatically simplified wiring harness for the Elite 1500 running the 2AR ECU. And as a reminder, if you buy the Elite 1500 ECU from me, links in the description, any of the tunes along the way that I make, either before or after you buy the ECU, will be available for free if you want to run the 2AR. So something to keep in mind, and plus it puts funds in the bank and helps me do more of this stuff. And then another video that's in the pipeline, these ignition coils. So for reasons unknown, Toyota has an absolute ton of part numbers for these things, and mechanically they're all interchangeable. So I can't, it doesn't, and it's not like everything in 2012 used the same part number. No. If you go to any given year, they've got 3, 4, 6, 10 different part numbers for coils that all have, you know, the same bolt and the same length and everything. So there's a reason for that. So in a future video, what I want to do, I think, is I want to make a test rig to be able to see how hard these things are hitting. And once I do that, then I can buy a whole bunch of these things and see which ones hit the hardest. And of course, the advantage there is the harder they hit, the wider we can make the gap. That allows us to ignite more fuel at the same time, use less timing, so you got less pressure coming up. It's just free power. It's not a lot, but on our way to 350 horsepower to the ground, we're going to need every horsepower we can get. So if there's factory coils that hit a little bit harder, and there's also, Excel has some coils, but they don't give a coil energy number on it. They just say 15% more. I'd be willing to bet between the different factory coils, there's more than a 15% variance. So 15% more than what? They're not that cheap, so I'd like to only buy one for testing. Yeah. I think that's all I got. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next one.